Hello everybody and welcome back to Environmental Science 101. Here we have part 2 of our biography of the Earth. So all the living stuff is around now. Okay, so we left off with our replicators is a key thing, right? And I said that evolution does the rest, and on some level that kind of glosses over it, but it's also kind of true, right? So evolution by natural selection starts once we have these, spreading throughout the ocean, some of them spreading better than others and some of them spreading worse, right? And now we get to start with that too today. To be clear, these replicators were not DNA, but that's the right concept, right? Okay, so we can return to our timeline, right? As far as where our replicators are coming online, we are about here, right? Maybe a little bit further back, depending on how you would want to determine it, right? But somewhere in this era of the Earth, way back when, right? Because remember, this is the present day. And to read it, you go down into the past from right to left. So we are all the way very close to the start of the Earth on the timeline. We will start with Precambrian, right? Cambrian is coming from Cambria in England. There are just particular rocks there where you get no fossils, no fossils, no fossils, and then all the fossils. And yeah, this is where they drew the boundary, and it's a very smart boundary to draw. But if we look at the numerical ages, right, we will notice that actually this is where most of the Earth's history happens, just in terms of the sheer number of years, right? So we start with 4.5 billion. Everything up until about 541 million, so half a billion years, is going to happen all before we get animal life, right? Before our Precambrian is done. This is most of the Earth's history in terms of number of years, and we also have some important events as we develop. Now we are kind of going to speed run these, which is fine. We have our first life develop, and we have oxygen into the atmosphere. The first life didn't necessarily produce oxygen. If it did, it probably would have killed itself and everything around it, so good thing. We get oxygen into the atmosphere somewhere in here. Not something that happens on its own. We have multicellular life, right? And this oxygen is coming from photosynthesis, especially blue-green algae on the bottom of the seafloor. Multicellular life is going to develop moving into our Proterozoic. Moving forward in time slowly, and we have our first animals here about 600 million years ago at the latest part of the Precambrian, right? So I have included this as one example, thought to be the first predator ever, this thing called Anomalocaris. It is also my niece's favorite prehistoric animal because it's cute, so that's cool. Something that we would call an adaptive radiation. Now we saw this a little bit with Darwin and the finches, right? You have some population of finches that are on a central island, and that population splits apart into all these different groups that go over to other islands, right? And then from that common ancestor, they branch out in every direction. This is similar, but at a much bigger scale, right? So again, if we're looking at the history of it in terms of preservation, right, essentially it goes nothing, 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 nothing. And then there is this explosion as all the major animal groups come into existence over what is a relatively short period of time, right? So just between kind of these parts of our timeline, after all this waiting. And yeah, this is a time when Mother Nature is essentially trying out body plans, going through her experimental phase. Have some weird things that have survived, so a lot of this stuff doesn't have any clear relation to modern day life, and we have no evidence of its existence except for a fossil or a shape. So this is an artist's rendition. It's more right than it is wrong, but truth be told, we have no idea how these things work. Predation is a question, right, of whether ecological rules, right, that there have to be predators are universal things. We will come back to this at the very end when we talk about rules for the world and complex systems, right? But it's important to ask that question now. Were there always predators? Okay, next we move into the Paleozoic, right? So we essentially came up here on the timeline, right? And then we went all the way down here about 540 million years ago. Birth of our Cambrian, or the bottom of the Cambrian, really. We have fish by this point, right? Really, we have fish by the end of this period, right? And they're starting to evolve into other things, right? Branch out into amphibians, reptiles, some of which are coming onto land even. We do have bugs coming in about this part, right? Silurian, Devonian era. Some of the bugs during this era overall can be much bigger than bugs today because there is more oxygen in the atmosphere in our Carboniferous, so this thing would have been human-sized, just as a fun fact. We finally get our land plants. Earliest ones, at least in this era, tend to be gymnosperms, right? Stuff with naked seeds, no fruit or flowers, everything kind of looks like a pine tree. To me, I'm sure that's very offensive to someone, but it does, okay. And it ends with a mass extinction of sea life, which, to be clear, is going to be most of the life on the planet at this point. So at the very end of this thing, the thing that divides our Paleozoic, right, our old life regime, from more modern stuff is going to be a mass extinction, and this will be a trend, right? Mass extinctions separate eras. About 80% of marine species, 70% of terrestrial vertebrates are wiped out at this time. That's a lot. We will see this drop later on, but this is the big mass extinction in Earth's entire history. Causes of it are complex, but I will just shortcut to the end of that now and tell you every mass extinction in the history of the Earth has one thing that they all have in common. It's two words, both of them start with a C. Yes, it is climate change. Okay, moving into our Mesozoic, right? So we end our old life era, fish life era, with a big mass extinction, and now we get to our Mesozoic, which maybe we are more familiar with. Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. No, we don't have to worry about any of these terms. That part is not the important part, right? We've got our middle era of life, dinosaurs, angiosperms, fruit, and flowers have come online. What we would call modern life as we think of it, right? And any guesses as to what this one ends with? Maybe we've heard of this before, right? So our impact, right? Killing the dinosaurs. This is coming at the end of our Mesozoic before we get to our final era, right? And if we have maybe heard of Pangaea, our little supercontinent, it has assembled, by about this point on the timeline, and then it is gone or starting to break up by about this time on the timeline. Okay, and we have our end with a mass extinction. Now, I said that all mass extinctions have climate change in common. This one does as well. It's thought to be a combination of impact, volcanism, and subsequent changes in climate, ultimately affecting the Earth. Okay, now we get to our final era, right? Our Cenozoic, modern life. We got terrestrial vertebrates, including mammals. We got angiosperms. We got a huge variety of life. And it looks like today, right? So we can just take a look at our desert setting here a little bit. Notice the resemblance between these and our plants on campus, even. They could be similar. Okay. All right. So now we have moved from right here on our timeline where the dinosaurs die out all the way up, right? And we're going to focus on this part up here, right? Where human beings are. So human beings are going to come online in their modern form at roughly this place where my mouse is. And this is not actually to scale. So that actually makes it look bigger than it is. So this very last sliver is where we're going to be focused. Now, I've mentioned mass extinctions, and we have talked previously about biodiversity and its changes over time. And now we can kind of put the two together with this timeline that we have established. So here we have 540, where we first get our animal life. We have, right, our number of marine families, which is a way of measuring biodiversity in this context. And we can notice, right, what happens to the biodiversity of the entire Earth on the big timeline. It starts small. It goes up pretty quickly. It's got some ups and downs, right? Then there is a huge drop-off, which we talked about. Then we get modern life, right? And there's punctuations of mass extinctions in between, right? None of them are as big as the big one that kills off this group. And it keeps going higher and higher and higher until today, right? So we can pretty confidently assess that biodiversity here, right, at the present day, is greater than it ever was in the past. But there is another part to this, right? If human activities are causing biodiversity to go down, that means that we have one of these happening again, really. So we should have one more of these mass extinction arrows right here. At least that seems to be the trend. Right, so this moves us to our final, well, it's not an era, right? This would be an age or an epoch on the scale. We don't care about that. It's the Holocene, named after us. Our ice age ends, so something like 10,000 years ago, the end of our last cold snap period. If you imagine the movie Ice Age and, the ice breaking up, that's perfect. That's exactly where we need to be. This is something we might call the Stone Age, right? And to correlate it with our timeline of human history, it's going to be the same time as agriculture develops, roughly speaking, right? And from this point onward, we start to have greatly accelerated human impacts on the world, ecologically speaking, and in every other dimension, including beginnings of our Holocene mass extinction. I've included the dodos here as a sort of example, right? So these were hunted to death and deforested to death in about the 17th century, which is not as long ago as I thought it was. So we have relatively modern human beings who are doing this. Hunted to extinction, they're gone, never coming back again, alongside many, many other species. So we can go back, right? So species are still going extinct during this time at some rate. Call that the background extinction rate, right? Other than the mass extinctions, though, we notice that the changes in the curve are fairly small. The rate that human beings cause species to go extinct, just to shortcut the math and get to the point, something like 100 to 1,000 times what it was before. Awesome. So, with this, we have connected our concepts of biodiversity to our concept of the overall timeline of the Earth. We have talked about the Earth's rotation, and now we can add one more factor into it, which is our atmosphere.